In open trucks, we drove toward the collective farm of Farmer Rosie. We started work at once in the fields. We had no cover vines with earth to save them from the cold, but the earth was like iron, and the poor plants had long since frozen dry. The work had been left too late. There would be no vineyard next year, and no one seemed to care. It was not their business. They made a play of carrying out the useless work and sent in their report. This vineyard had been one of the most famous in Romania. Its owner was now in prison. But the victims of forcible collectivization were by no means the big landlords. Small farmers and peasants were the hardest hit. Their attempts to revolt against the system were ruthlessly crushed, and they became sullen and indifferent. They worked as little as possible. Then, for failing to discharge their obligations to the state, they were jailed by the thousand. The land remained untilled. The former granary of Europe forced famine, and the state's answer was to send prisoners as slave labor on the collectives. It was the same everywhere. The fields were cultivated so badly that little grew. The guards put to watch over us were often peasants themselves. One told how he had been ordered to shoot the first man he saw in a village. Then the villagers were gathered and invited to join the collective of their own free will. Officials searched the homes of unwilling farmers. Always they found that they were hiding arms, guns the police had planted. Farmers' wives told how the collectivization teams had taken everything they owned: cattle, carts, farming tools. Mrs. Manuela, a big-boned peasant woman who worked beside me, said, "When everything was gone, my husband said, 'Our hymn book remains. Let us sing to the Lord and thank him for the greater possessions we have in heaven.'" Mrs. Manuela possessed a favorite cow. She spoke of it tenderly, how she embraced its neck on cold mornings, how its warmth had spread through her body. "Cows don't give good milk unless you love them," she said. "Now it's just a beast like other beasts." On the collectives, nothing was done with love. There was no blessing from God. While working in the fields one morning, I collapsed. The sweatshop, the collectives, had ended my resistance. Guards put me on an improvised stretcher. I was carried to the truck and taken to Vakarest Prison Hospital. On the way, my head had swollen until I guessed it must have taken the shape of a melon. I knew the prison well. Richard had preached there in the old days. I'd come at Christmas with parcels to help prepare a tree. Instead of a hospital ward, I was put into an isolated cell in which there was nothing except a dirty bucket in the corner. I slept on the bare concrete. Next morning, looking out through the window, I saw male prisoners taking their exercise. When they passed my window, I asked if they had heard anything about Richard Wurmbrand. The first and second man shook their head. The guard was taking a nap. The third, when he heard my request, said, "Wurmbrand, the pastor?" "Yes," I replied. "He is my husband." He bowed to the earth as the Orthodox do in church. "I met him," he whispered. "I do not regret my 10 years in prison. They were worthwhile because the pastor brought me to Christ. And now I meet his wife." He had to pass on, but he had not told me if Richard still lived. He went around the yard, head down, hands behind his back. When he passed near the window again, he added, "I met him at Tergel Okna. He was in the cell for the dying. He always spoke about Christ." On his next trip round the yard, I found my new friend was a schoolteacher. The guard yawned. His nap was over, and he ordered the prisoners back to their cells. But I knew that Richard continued to be Richard, to exalt Christ, to win souls. Or was he referring to a past long ago? As to the mark of high respect, I was not surprised. Romanians generally had a deep respect for those who brought them to Christ. I remained another day in the cell, no doctor calling to examine me, but I was happy to remain there, hoping to see the teacher again. I did not believe that Richard was dead. I cannot say why, but a verse from the Bible came like music to my mind. It concerned Jacob's son, Reuben, which is Richard's Hebrew name. "Let Reuben live and not die." It was to me a promise. After 48 hours, the hospital authorities remembered I had been admitted as an urgent case. I was put in a bed with sheets and blankets. A woman doctor in a clean white coat walked the wards. "Now you must eat everything you're given," she said. The kindness of her voice brought tears to my eyes. Dr. Maria Krashin was fresh from medical school. With courage and patience, she worked in understaffed, overcrowded Bucharest, adored by her patients. "I had an ugly skin trouble, a kind of scurvy," she said, resulting from malnutrition. "I must eat. It was the only cure." She gave me injections, and the trouble began to fade. Sores and scabs on my body began to heal. The colitis and diarrhea ceased. I could even see more clearly. Lack of vitamins plays tricks with the eyesight, and many prisoners were blind by night. In the next bed was a once wealthy woman. She wasn't too upset at being in prison. She was sure she'd be free soon. Wasn't Eisenhower America's president, and Winston Churchill Britain's prime minister? Two great soldiers would not let East Europe remain in slavery. "When the Americans come, they'll make the Russians pay war compensation. Taking into account my former income, I shall ask 5,000 lei a day for the 6 months I've been in prison. That is 1,000,000 lei. I shall be secure for the rest of my life." I suggested she might as well ask for 10,000 lei a day. Then she'd have 2 millions. "What a good idea," she said. "You Jews are clever people." The other prisoners called her the millionairess. We played games in a ward, which often ended in tears. We tried to imagine how life would be when we were deaf old women. A word was passed from one end of a row to the other. Each patient distorted it a little, so that it emerged as something different. But the laughter and the excitement upset us, and once it had changed to weeping, the ward was caught up in a crisis of grief. Many were young, and they saw their youth passing away. The game would become reality. Bucharest was supervised by a political officer. Medicine, like everything else, had to be practiced in the spirit of the class struggle. One evening he came into the ward with some uniformed colleagues and made a pompous speech about the joys of communism. When such fine hospitals as this were freely available, who needed God? He asked. I said, "Lieutenant, as long as there will be people on earth, we will need God and we will need Jesus, who gives life and health." He was outraged. How did I dare to interrupt? How could I go on believing such stuff? I said, "Everyone who lives in a house knows it has been built by an architect, just as everyone who attends a banquet knows it was prepared by a cook. We are all invited to the banquet of this world, which is so full of wonderful things, the sun, the moon, stars and rain and fruits of all kinds, and we know that the one who has prepared this is God." The political officer laughed and scoffed and walked out with his friends, banging the door. Next morning a guard came and told me to pack. The same day I was sent back to the labor colonies. This time it was the state pig farm, where 50 women tended several hundred swine. The years had been hard, but this was the hardest of all. Food was at starvation level. We dragged ourselves from our beds at 5 a.m., still wearing the filthy rags in which we had lain down, and went out into the cold and darkness to feed the pigs. The sties were ankle-deep in liquid filth, the one substance that never froze. A vile, nauseating stench hung over the place and penetrated every angle of our huts. It hung about the body and hair. The very skilly we slopped up with our wooden spoons savored of it. We were better off than the prodigal son. We filled our bellies with the husks that the swine did eat. The meaning fell away from things. Death stared me in the face. The whole world was made of tears and despair as never before, and a cry rose from my heart, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Trying to clean their sties was as hopeless as trying to clean the world. Each day we started afresh, wet, hungry, and half dead, to cart away in barrows the mountains of filth. I knew there was no hope for me, nor for the world, and expected only to die. And perhaps, in a psychological condition such as this, I should not have survived for long. but happily it did not last for many weeks. I am convinced that the Lord heard my prayers and took me out according to his plan. I had only to learn a very deep lesson, to drink the cup to its bitterest dregs, and now I am thankful that I passed through this hard school, which teaches you the highest love, love toward God, even when he gives nothing but suffering. From the back of an open truck, I watched the pig farm receding, a dark huddle of huts in the white landscape. The wind was like a cold steel hand. It tugged at the flaps of our clothes and sent fine skeins of snow skittering across the land. No one knew or asked or greatly cared where we were headed. One collective was identical with the next. But unexpectedly, we came to Gensia, the transit camp from which, over 2 years ago, I had set out for the canal. "What crowds of women! The place is busier than ever," we whispered among ourselves as we waited to be checked and numbered. "What's going on?" It was after dark before they'd finished with us and we could be marched off to the huts. The circulation returned to our stiff limbs. Inside, in the comparative warmth, hope began to seep through us like a thaw. The hundreds of women who packed this and every hunt in Gensia came from camps all over. Either they planned some big new slave labor scheme, but no one dared to voice that hope. We'd been through too much. We'd gulled ourselves too often. On the second day, a rumor spread. In the offices at Gensia, 2 men from security headquarters were working on dossiers. Our dossiers! They'd arrived from Bucharest 2 days ago. Could it really mean freedom? I looked around the hut. Under the dim, unshaded lights, scarecrow women sat and talked in low voices, turning over the rumor, pulling it inside out, talking, and all the while our minds were planning for the future. The smell of sour food and sour bodies hung like a miasma in the air. Loudspeakers had been added to the camp equipment. From time to time they gave forth vast, crackling sounds like amplified frying eggs and roared out incomprehensible, distorted messages. When the first sensation had passed, you saw women sitting blank-eyed for hours at a time, waiting. No, they didn't believe they would leave it behind, ever. Some of the gypsy girls I'd known at Cherdevoda were there, and one day I heard my name called. "Sabina! Sabina!" It was Zenaida, who had queened it in pre-war Bucharest from K4. She had done a round of collectives too. We tried to clasp each other's hands, then stopped, for all our fingers were swollen and cracked with chilblains. We laughed and told our stories, or as much of them as we could bear. She insisted that I take a pair of men's trousers and a warm jacket which she'd scrounged from somewhere. I did so gratefully. "It's Charlie Chaplin to the life." The others stood back to take in the effect. "Even her boots have tabs on the back." Soon enough, we came around to discussion of the vital topic. How much longer? Does it mean what we think it means? Then guards began to take us for questioning at the camp offices. Zenaida was in one of the early groups. She told me, "It was just like any old interrogation, really, only very polite, and instead of asking about you, they asked what we thought about them." The customary 3 officers in uniform sat behind desks covered with papers, Zenaida said. After a few questions about her health and how we were enjoying our stay and did we have relatives outside, things took a more unusual turn. They asked, "Do you know how wrong you were to oppose the building of socialism? What do you think of your re-education in prison? Do you understand that the state was right to give you this chance to reform? That nothing and no one will be able to turn back the tide of communism?" Naturally, I told them I'd enjoyed every minute, said Zenaida. What a pompous ass in charge, ranting on about national achievements and our fine farms and splendid camps. To me, dear, after 3 years and 9 months of it. Like most prisoners, she did her best to give the impression that she had seen the errors of her ways and was now eager to work for a place in society. Before the month was out, small groups of women began to leave Gensia. As always, we didn't know where they might be headed. Lists of names were read out, parties were marched to the camp offices, then driven off in trucks. But it was one more small, hopeful sign. Eventually, my turn came. The major behind the desk was stout and pink as a baby. He had hands like fat little bunches of sausages, and with them he kept clearing the objects on his desk while he talked, as if he might need to jump up on it later to round off his speech. There were a few special questions reserved for religious prisoners. "In this place, Mrs. Wurmbrand, you must know that I am more powerful than God. At least, he has not so far made any interventions in this office." He took as his due the appreciative smiles of the two assistants. "But have you really accepted this? Have you really seen through the sham of religion? Have you realized that in a communist society, God is superfluous, that you don't need him any more? If you are ever released from here, you'll be astonished at the achievements of recent years, and we are only beginning." The gold braid on his epaulettes was new and glittering. Under his sausage hand was a buff file stuffed with papers which might be mine. I said, "I see that you are powerful, and probably you have papers and documents there about me that I've never seen and can decide my fate. But God keeps records too, and neither you nor I would have life without him. So whether he keeps me here or sets me free, I'll accept that is best for me." The major banged both fists on the desk, as if it were something he could hurt. "Ungrateful, Mrs. Wurmbrand, ungrateful. I'm sorry to see you failed to learn your lesson, and I shall make a report to that effect." He shouted in mock rage for a few more minutes. But 3 days later, my name was read out. High authorities than the major were indeed deciding my future. We stood waiting in the snow-covered yard outside the camp offices with our poor bundles. Even now we weren't at all sure that we'd be freed. It was only when we'd been marched out through the gates of twanging barbed wire and stood shivering in the road that the guard began the long process of handing out slips of paper. The wind carried his hoarse voice away. "Wurmbrand, Sabina, born Czernowtsi, 1913, resident at..." I took the document ordering my release. Certificate of Liberation was the heading, but it was growing too dark to read. The last bars of copper showed in the sky as we piled into a truck and drove off. Ghinsia is only a few miles from Bucharest, but we were dropped well outside the outskirts of the town. I walked with my greasy, smelly bundle through the suburbs. For the first time in nearly 3 years, I saw people hurrying home from work, shopping for their families. Home! That was where I was heading, if it existed. If anything existed. Homes, friends, family. I didn't know what had happened to any of them. Mihai would be 14 now. What had the years done to him? I was almost frightened of finding out, and longed to see him at the same time. How the lights dazzled my eyes, and the smells of food from restaurants shocked my senses. I wanted to cover my ears against the screeching metal of the trams, to cower from their plumes of falling blue sparks. As the stream of people hustled past indifferently, a sense of dismay came over me. I looked for the number 7 tram stop. Perhaps it didn't exist any longer. Yes, there it was. I suppressed my panic and climbed aboard, then realized I had no money. I said loudly, "Would someone be so kind as to pay my fare?" All heads turned to see who made this unusual request, and a glance was enough to know why it was made. A dozen people immediately offered to pay for me. They crowded around, their eyes full of sympathy. This kind of thing was a part of life now. Everyone there, it seemed, had a relative or friend in prison. They asked no questions, only mentioned names of their dear ones whom I might know. We passed near Victory Street with sad memories of the police station where I'd first been held. Nothing had changed. The giant portraits of mankind's 4 geniuses, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, still stared down at the crowds who tramped through the slush. I left the tram near a block of flats I knew and climbed the stairs. The door was opened by a friend. "Sabina!" She put her hands to her mouth and stepped back. "Is it possible?" We embraced. "I feel quite faint," she said, and began to cry. Someone ran to fetch Mihai. My heart seemed to stop as I saw him come through the door. He was tall and pale, and so thin, but a young man now. As we embraced, the tears began to flow down my cheeks at last. He wiped them away with his hands. "Don't cry too much, mother," he said. At that moment it seemed to me that all my troubles were over and that I would never need to cry again.